So if you take any company, you've got time on the bottom axis, you've got dollars on this axis. And so you have sales and your company's growing. Right? So there's a slope to this sales. And let's just say that it's 10% per annum sales growth. This is your top line revenue. So then what sort of fits underneath it? And so one of the common categories of costs that people look at is G&A, right? So general and administrative expense. If the slope of the growth of G&A is greater than the slope of this line, your strategy is not working, right? Because at some stage, this slope is going to become closer and closer to your revenue line. And the closer and closer that it gets, it means that there's less margin. It means that the strategy in order to grow sales is not as effective as the cost that it is to actually deliver it, costing you more than you're making. So eventually, this line's going to cross. That means the strategy is failing. The other way to look at it is you can add in another component here, which is SG&A. So SG&A is sales and general and administrative expense. Same thing applies, right? So where does IT spend fit? IT spend fits in, so let's just take out sales for now just to make it simpler, right? And so when you think about G&A, if G&A is growing at a rate that is below sales, this means your strategy is working. Hallelujah. But what's inside G&A? It's general and administrative expense. IT is in general and administrative expense. So if IT is growing at a declining rate, or if IT is growing at the same rate, or if IT is growing at an increased rate than G&A, it means different things.
What does the first one mean?
Right? So as a relative spend, if IT is declining, it means you're not getting leverage. IT is not actually helping you deliver your business model. If it's the same, it's just neutral, right? So administrative expense is increasing, IT expense is increasing. It's increasing at the same relative rate. It just basically means that you're stable and things are going in the right rate.
But you're not innovating.
You're not innovating, you're not changing the game, you're not doing more with less, you're not doing any of those things. So then you start to get into this notion of, well, what if IT is growing at a faster rate than G&A is growing? Well, that implies that the areas outside of IT that are incorporated within G&A, the cost of those are declining. Well, how would they be declining if sales is increasing? It means that IT is actually creating some leverage. It's doing more with less. Of course, you have to spend more on IT in order to get the more with less, but you're using less of the rest of the G&A category in order to deliver what it needs to deliver.
What does that mean in real life?
Well, so what's inside G&A? So operations would be inside G&A. Finance is inside G&A. So it means you're using less people in there.
So you're leveraging more tools.
You're leveraging more tools. You're leveraging more IT to do the work that the general administrative responsibilities are intended to deliver.
Is that considered an asset once it is an IT tool and not an IT person?
Potentially. So this is where things can get really interesting. That's just general finance leverage talk. So if I look at my revenue, if I'm a business and I'm in a specific sector, I can benchmark how my growth is going versus my competitor's growth. So if I'm at 10% and my competitor's at 5%, I'm happy. If I'm at 10% and my competitor's at 20%, I'm not so happy. But it's the same thing when you're benchmarking on revenue, you can benchmark on this stuff too. So if you want to benchmark what your competitors are spending on G&A, you can do that. And so if you are over-indexed, on G&A, competitor one G&A, if you're spending more on G&A, you're less cost effective. If you're spending less, you're more cost effective, right? So you should be benchmarking your G&A. As an example, you should also be benchmarking IT spend, right? So if IT spend, again, let's just make it neutral. If IT spend right now is on the same slope of growth as G&A is, so you're neither gaining or losing your competitiveness in terms of efficiency. If you're on the same slope, you should be benchmarking this number in your sector. You should be benchmarking this number in your sector. If you're above or below, it starts to tell you things, right? So if IT spend is below your sector, well, you're missing out on opportunities. If it's above, so in this situation, if this number is going this way, right, and you're over-indexed on IT, but then you are under-indexed on G&A for your competitors, yeah, okay, you're spending more money on IT, but you're actually spending less money on G&A overall. So that's a gain. That's a benefit, right? And so, like, how do you know these things are happening? How do you set it up in a way where you can actually begin to track whether IT is really contributing to improving the performance of your business?
It also probably touches on the valuation of your organization. Do they look at
Well,
these things?
naturally, like when you're looking at the valuation of an organization, so there's top line sales, right? Sales growth, there's earnings per share growth, there's margin, etc. There's all these sort of financial metrics that contribute to the market's confidence in what the value of the business actually really is. So if your top line sales growth, if it begins to improve because you're leveraging more concepts in IT, hallelujah, everybody's happy. If this situation is happening where you're under-indexed in G&A, but you're over-indexed in IT, but you're still getting an advantage, your earnings per share is going to go up, right? Your margin's going to go up, which means your earnings per share is going to go up, which means your EBITDA is going up. If your EBITDA is going up, your multiple on your EBITDA can improve.
So how does narrative come in? You come in and you assess these things.
Well, so I mean, these are all just financial concepts that any CFO is fully aware of. All of these kinds of concepts, fully aware. What we do is we help you put it into the context so that you can understand and measure the contribution that IT is creating for the business.
Nice.
Right? And so we enhance the knowledge that the CFO already has and put in mechanisms and measurement to allow the CFO to communicate with the rest of the executive team how IT is doing in terms of helping be more competitive.
So this can be an assessment or an engagement.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, in order to do all the benchmarking and in order to get everything all set up to begin with, it's an assessment. And then it can be an ongoing thing where incrementally we come in and just and evaluate how you're doing on the roadmap to actually achieve it.
When's a good time for a customer to take advantage of this?
Whenever you're thinking about change, whenever you're frustrated with IT. The IT leaders have never been trained to think this way. They've always been trained to make technology work. So they're focused on making things work. They're not terribly focused on making it work with a set of constraints that are beyond you're allowed to spend this much money, right? And so what we're doing is we're adding a number of constraints on how you're spending the money in order to allow the business to improve its performance. Does that make sense?